Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Karbach Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. I'm joined as always by my good friend, co-host, and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves, who you can follow on Twitter at Paulo Alves NBA. Me, I'm at Ben Dubose. So as we chat this Sunday, May 12th, it's been a phenomenal day for your Houston Rockets. As you most likely know by the time you're listening to this pod, the Rockets defied the lottery odds yet again. They're at number 3 overall with the pick they landed from the Brooklyn Nets in the early 2021 James Harden blockbuster trade. That deal continues to age like fine wine. It's just getting better and better. Rockets already have Tari Eason and the number 3 overall pick in 2024 out of that deal, and they still have 3 years to come of unprotected first-round assets, either swaps or direct pick conveyances from the Nets at a time in which Brooklyn's outlook is looking worse and worse as the months progress. So kudos to Rafael Stone for not taking the Ben Simmons deal. I think the Rockets certainly had some luck in that the odds of the Nets pick going from the number 9 slot, which it was in the pre-lottery odds, to number 3 overall were basically 15% to get a top 3 pick from where the Nets were in the lottery standings. However, the saying of luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity is, I think, a good way to describe what went down here, because the Rockets made a bet against the Brooklyn Nets, and at this point it is paying dividends in a big way. And that's why you get so many years of assets, because all it takes is 1 or 2 having the roll the dice go your way, and all of a sudden it completely changes the complexion of the deal. So again, kudos to Rafael Stone. That trade he made with the Nets for James Harden back in January 2021, it's looking absolutely brilliant these days, despite the criticism he took in the very early going. I think certainly the Rockets have had the lottery gods smiling on them, because you look at a team like the Detroit Pistons, who has had basically the best odds of anyone the last 3 years and has not gotten a lottery pick a single time. They did get Cade Cunningham number 1 overall in 2021, but the last 3 years, all at number 5, despite being in the 3 worst teams. That gives you the best odds under the NBA's new lottery format. I don't think everyone realizes just how much the odds have changed since 2019, since the NBA flattened those odds to try and serve as a deterrent to tanking. You can easily, even if you're the worst team or one of the 3 worst with the best odds, it's still a 50-50 coin flip, and the Pistons have lost that 50-50 coin flip for 3 years running. Instead, the Rockets actually won the 50-50 coin flip for 3 years running, getting Jalen Green at number 2, Jabari Smith Jr. at number 3, Amen Thompson at number 4, and now get another lottery pick from the Nets that was 2080 just to get into the top 4, and actually 1585 when you look at the top 3 where they actually ended up. So definitely a good day for the Rockets, a little bit of luck, but again, I think there was a lot of preparation that went into this, and this is why when you can get that many years of unprotected assets, and the key word is unprotected. The Rockets lost their pick to Oklahoma City, which ended up at 12 in the lottery, where most people expected it to be, but it was top 4 protected. Even in that terrible Chris Paul, Russell Westbrook trade, Daryl Morey had the foresight to put top 4 protection, or perhaps Sam Presti and the Thunder did not have the leverage to get it fully unprotected. In the James Harden deal, Rafael Stone did get those assets unprotected, so that in this case, when it landed top 4, it still conveys from the Nets to the Rockets. So great bit of negotiating. I think the Rockets certainly had more leverage with James near the peak of his MVP powers, and kudos to Rafael Stone in the front office for taking advantage of that. What I will say is that I think this outcome just raises the stakes considerably on this offseason. There were already some reports that the Rockets were looking to trade their first round pick this year, perhaps for future assets. And I think we all know why. This is a team that's already on the rise, 41-41. They've got a core six. How many young guys can you conceivably play, especially when you're trying to win at a higher level by the year? And so I think a lot of us weren't all that excited about this draft because it is supposed to be a little weaker than most years. And combine that with picking at 9 or 10, which is a range in which most guys aren't instant contributors anyway. And a lot of us just figured, hey, this is going to get offloaded in some form or fashion, either as part of a larger trade for a win now upgrade or for future picks to just sort of roll it back in terms of value, because it's like driving a new car off the lot. We've made that analogy before. If you draft a young player and then you don't play him much, from a value perspective, it makes more sense to sort of play it out longer if you can. We've seen the Patriots do this in the NFL for a long while. But by jumping to number 3, the stakes have really risen. And I think some people will look at it and say, well, the Rockets are more likely to trade the pick because, well, they were already projected to do that by most of the experts. And now a pick at number 3 should be much more desirable. I agree that's probably the most likely outcome. Gun to my head, I do think they trade the pick, and this should greatly expand the interest. But I also think there's a world in which they could keep the pick, because when you're at number 3 overall, highest in the Western Conference, only trailing Atlanta and Washington, there's absolutely a path for you to fall in love with a player and that guy to actually be on the board. If you're at number 9, you're not going to get someone in all likelihood that you have number 1 on your draft board or even number 2. At number 3 overall, you easily could. So the stakes are a lot higher. Again, I do think they'll certainly explore trading it in terms of, I guess, the young core transitioning from a core 6 to a core 7 at some point. That is a lot of mouths that you have to feed. Can the Rockets win at a high level by inserting another 19 or 20-year-old? Those are fair questions. But at the end of the day, and Rafael Stone said this in his press conference after the draft lottery, they generally go best player available. And if they see someone that they really like, that they think is going to be a star player, a successful player, then they're not afraid to add yet another young player to this mix. And I think that possibility is greater today based on going to number 3. At number 9, it felt like something of a foregone conclusion. They would just do everything they could to move off of it. And in a draft that's weaker than most, then it's not like you'd be that excited about what you got as a potential return. By moving to number 3, I think certainly the pick should have more interest around the league, and that's great. And the Rockets will do their due diligence. But I also think there is a world where the Rockets actually do have a prospect at the top of this draft that they really like. And even if it's an awkward fit, if they think that the value there is better than what it would be by trade, then I don't think they will hesitate to make the pick. Because even though it's supposed to be a weaker draft, just look back to 2020. People said the same thing back then. And Anthony Edwards has turned out to be the best number 1 pick out of any draft this entire decade. That draft also had Tyrese Halliburton around pick 10, Tyrese Maxey around pick 20, Desmond Bane around pick 30. These are all all-star or borderline all-star level guys. And that was supposed to be a bad draft. You had LaMelo Ball, who when healthy has shown a lot, at number 3. So even drafts that aren't supposed to be that good, there are definitely very talented players in there, even if the overall depth isn't what it typically is. And so for the Rockets today, initial thoughts, first off, thank you, lottery gods. It has been one hell of a day yet again. Thank you, Rafael Stone, for doing the legwork to put the Rockets in position to take advantage of this luck. And then as far as the next 6 weeks and the pre-draft scouting process, to me, Paolo, it's just far more exciting now than it was before. I can't tell you for sure that they're going to trade the pick. I can't tell you for sure that they're going to keep it, but it just feels like the stakes have been raised dramatically. The level of interest is much higher than it was even 24 hours ago. And so because of that, I'm suddenly much more engaged with this pre-draft process than I was before. I guess that's what stands out to me, because regardless of what the end result is, they're going to or should end up with a very quality asset out of this, when if they were at 9 or 10, they probably would not have, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack, obviously. First of all, how lucky can a franchise be? I mean, we're not at the Cavs level of drafting like or not back to back or close to it, number one overall picks, and then or I think it was 3 in 4 years or something crazy like that. But this is as close as it gets. We want like people usually like to look at the lottery in a way that, oh, we either moved up or we moved down compared to our record. That's not how the lottery works. Every year with the new system, I don't know how it was before, there's four winners. There's four teams that drew, I guess, the long straw and or the short straw, whatever the analogy is. And those four teams get the top four picks, which then are, sorted into an order between those four. And then the rest of the teams just move back whatever spots they need to move back to make that work. The Rockets have picked top four every single year of this rebuild, so they've won the lottery 4 times. Shout out to Andrew Sukup on Twitter. He actually did the math on this. The Rockets are at the 97th percentile of luck over the last 4 years. The outcomes that they got. And I know people will still say, oh, we never got the number one overall pick, or we fell out of the first tier last year, which, apparently it wasn't actually the way the tiers ended up shaking out, but we will have time to analyze that as these guys' careers develop. So the luck factor is obviously amazing for the Rockets, but as you said, it's not just luck. When Rafael Stone made the decision to take the picks over Ben Simmons, it was exactly with it in mind that this was a possibility. That this was taking the picks is obviously a higher range of outcomes compared to taking a guy like Ben Simmons, who we know turned out poorly, or pretty much as poorly as it could have possibly turned out. But this is what was supposed to happen. This was the reason we took the picks. The fact that it materialized shouldn't be considered luck because this was the plan all along. Perhaps not as high of an outcome as this, but this was very much within the thought process of taking the Harden deal that Stone took. But then, just moving on from that into how this affects the Rockets' outlook, I think it's massive. People want to say that this draft is a weak draft. I will say, I think, listen, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I've done the draft work that I've done over the past 3 years on this draft as well. I haven't. I was actually preparing for this podcast. I was actually scouting mostly guys that were projected to go 6 through, 15-ish. Because that's what I was expecting to do. I was expecting the pick to land at 10. So I trusted. I was doing a little bit of scouting on the guys that could reasonably fall to 10, so 6 onwards. And then I went all the way through 15 because I think that there's a plateau in talent at this range. And I also thought that it could make sense for the Rockets to trade back in the draft if they cannot trade out of the pick entirely if they were picking at 10. So I was not expecting this, but I do feel like there is a little bit, and I think as time goes on, the tier gaps will materialize more as the insiders get a little bit of insight on how teams are thinking, because that's usually what happens. But I do think that you've got a tier 1-ish in Alex Sarr, the other French that I'm not going to try to pronounce the name of.
Zachary Rizache.
Yeah,
I typed in his name for an ounce.
I'm European. I'm not going to try that. That's too many R's for.
And then Nikola Topic, the Serbian guard.
I would actually, instead of him, because of how unsure I am, because of how long he was injured for, and how small the sample size is, I would actually sneak in Reed Sheppard there.
Okay. No, the way I was sort of looking at it is there's the 3 international guys that we just listed, and then there's at least 3 college guys between Reed Sheppard, Donovan Clingan, and I would throw Rob Dillingham in there as well. So I would say 3 college guys, 3 international guys that are in that top tier or potentially in that top tier. I mean, maybe Stephon Castle, but I think Castle is a little limited upside wise. I wouldn't put him quite in that tier 1.
I would actually think so. Obviously, this is with very little, actual, in-depth scouting work done. But what I'm leaning at right now is I mean, it's tough to see that much upside with Reed Sheppard just because of the size concerns and his he has a 6'3" wingspan, And guys can make it work. I think Steph Curry has something similar to that. And he does have a game that somewhat resembles the tendencies that Curry has, which is just leverage his insane shooting in the maximum way possible, and then finish, and then limited-ish finishing at the rim, or the same types of finishes where he's not getting fully downhill, with a lot of floaters, a lot of leveraging, whatever downhill speed he has into open mid-range jump shots and those types of floaters off glass that Curry likes to do as well. But to me, I guess I'll move on from how big of a jump this is. I think with pick 10, you likely have, if you want to trade for a star, you likely have to package 10, perhaps more Brooklyn picks, perhaps, maybe one of the core 6 or Dylan Brooks or something like that if you want to go and try and get a star. I think pick 3 is within the realm of possibility that you could swing at guys that are on the lower echelon of stars that you might be able to get straight up for pick 3. I don't think it would be that far-fetched that the Pelicans would take pick 3 straight up for Brandon Ingram, especially considering how they
So
seem
you
to
would
be
have to
leaning.
include salary filler, but yeah, I see what you're getting at.
But I think value-wise, pick 3, Brandon Ingram, considering how they've already hinted at moving Brandon Ingram, could be something that materializes, right? And I'm personally a fan of Brandon Ingram. I know a lot of people aren't. I'm positive on getting another guy that can create his own shot at any point, because right now we have Alperen Sengun, who can create his own shot in very specific circumstances that are out of the post, obviously.
Well, the way that I would frame it, I think both for salary reasons and rotation reasons, if you bring in someone of Ingram's stature, and I'm with you, I would at least explore that. I was a little surprised. Jackson Gatlin pushed back. Chris White did as well. And of course, I respect them, but I think Ingram's being a little undervalued at the moment. If you can get him at a discounted rate with the understanding of what his next contract might look like, because he would be an unrestricted free agent in 2025, you'd have bird rights, but you don't want to do that deal if there's legitimate risk of him walking for no compensation in a year. You want to make sure you're on the same page about the long term. But if you can, I mean, he's someone that can create his own shot. That's something that this team struggled with for a lot of last season. We know the high end upside they have defensively. We trust Ime Udoka on that side of the ball as well. Offensively, there are still questions. I would consider that move. Obviously, we've talked about different guys in the past, Paul George, Donovan Mitchell. I do think you'd probably end up moving at least one guy out of your top 9, simply because if you add Brandon Ingram, and I'm just using him as a hypothetical here, it could be anyone, to a rotation that's already 10 deep. At some point, you'd be cutting minutes for someone so drastically that it's sort of like, at least in my mind, why wouldn't you just move them, because you're going to get more value out of them that way, as opposed to cutting the minutes so small that they're barely playing if you're fully healthy. So I do think that there's a chance that you would package 3 and someone from your top 9, that being the regular starters, plus Amen Thompson, Tari Eason, Cam Whitmore, and Steven Adams off the bench. However, I think the difference between pick 9 and pick 10 and pick 3 is enough to where you could package it with someone of a lower tier, i.e. a Dylan Brooks or a Steven Adams. You might not have to go into your core 6 because of the strength of pick 3 value-wise. Like the trade I proposed, because it's pretty easy to get there, you could do Dylan Brooks, pick 3, one of your filler contracts, Jock Landale or Jeff Green, and get right to Brandon Ingram's dollar figure in the low 30s. That's something that if you were combining Dylan and pick 10 or pick 9, I don't think the asset value is there. If you're combining Dylan and pick 3, I think it is. And so because of that, it opens the door to making a marquee acquisition without having to dip into your core 6. That's the intrigue to me. Does that make sense?
It does. And to bring in Brandon Ingram's credit in specific, he has something that a lot of guys don't, or a combination that's really tough to get in a trade for a star. I'm almost 100% sure that Donovan Mitchell, what the other guy that people mentioned may be available, is Supermax eligible. Brandon Ingram is not. He has never made an All-NBA team, even though I think a lot of people would argue that he has a talent to do so. He's obviously had some injury issues, but other than that, I think he is a bona fide all-star player.
And he's still only 26 years old.
And that's the second factor that I was about to mention. He's only 26 going into his age 27 season, so you could extend him, just give him a max extension. He has 1 year left on his contract. I think with 1 year left, you are allowed to extend players already. So you could, you could trade with the understanding of an extension and do it right away, not wait the entire year until you lock him up, and you'd have him through age 32, which is ideal. Age 32 is ideal for the end of the contract of the star. At that point, you can then make the decision if you want to move on from them or if you want to keep going if they're still playing at prime levels. And at the same time, you retain the asset value in case you want to trade them down the line throughout the contract. So I think Ingram makes a lot of sense. The Pelicans have shown to be open to inserting more young players into their rotation. If not last year, the year before, but I think it was last year. Everybody was expecting them to trade the pick that eventually became Dyson Daniels, and they didn't. They drafted him. I think he's in year 2 now, and they incorporated him into the rotation, and they've rolled on with it. They have Trey Murphy in the rotation. Zion's obviously a young player, but he's an exception. Herb Jones is another example of this. They held on to Cairo Lewis for a long time. I think Nikhil Alexander Walker was also a Pelican for a long time. They're not afraid to have many young players and bring them along in the rotation. So I wouldn't put it past them to be interested in an asset like pick 3. That being said, that's obviously the side of trading the pick. If the Rockets were to select someone, my very early on criteria for the pick is I think if they're going to do that, then the pick, with very few exceptions, would likely not play year 1, at least for the first half. I think they would get a lot of the same treatment that Amen Thompson and Cam Whitmore got this year, where they started off in the T League for a fairly long stretch.
Amen didn't, but yeah, I know the point.
Yeah, but he got hurt, and then he
Right.
went down, and then eventually came back up. This to say, they were clearly too good for the G League, and so they were slowly incorporated into the main team with a role that's that wasn't too big right away. They had to fit into a role, and I think long term that will help their development. And I think this year's draft has a lot of guys that need some time to develop, which fits perfectly with what I think the Rockets should do. That being said, I do think that obviously you want to go BPA, but I wouldn't go BPA to the fullest extent in this draft. I'm just not interested in researcher, whatever. I'm not interested in wing prospects, basically at all. I think the Rockets long-term, Jabari is a known quantity at this point, Tariq is a known quantity at this point, and Cam Whitmore is not a known quantity, but he's better than whoever you're going to draft as a wing prospect in this draft. So
yeah, to me, it's 3 things. It's rim protection, it's shooting, and it's ball handling. You've got to have someone that excels at one of those areas. To me, those are the general needs, I think, surrounding what they have already.
100%, which is why, to me, it has to be. We have no idea how these boards are going to shape up, because I think there's people who have Topic number 1, people who have even Clingan number 1, people who have Sarr number 1, people who have Zach. I'll call him Zach, French dude, number 1 as well. So to me, if it's the guys I'm looking at, depending on how boards shape up, Alex Sarr is phenomenal. I think he'll be phenomenal in the NBA. He's really agile. He has the size. He has the length. He has the jump shot. He has the balance. I think he'll have to learn to play with a little bit more strength. I think, obviously, because of his slight frame, that's a work in progress. But I do think that he is a guy that potentially could be a really nice fit next to Alperen Sengun. If Alperen Sengun's not there, for one reason or another, I think he makes a lot of sense as the sole big man as well. And then after him, you obviously have all the point guard prospects, which I would be interested in. But from my perspective, even though Rafael Stone is obviously going to say BPA, and I'm sure we'll talk about what he said after the draft, it makes sense to take guys that realistically could play a position other than the wing position, because we're so stacked there. And you don't want to go full, we're throwing them into the G League for 3 years, because we've seen guys who were, upside picks have that done to them and then never been able to, break out of that G League level. You have to have, not a path prepared for them to ascend into the main team, but at least have a few, weakened links within the team that they can realistically, throughout the first couple of years, break into that starting lineup. What this means with the current setup on the roster is, Fred VanVleet is obviously has a firm place with the main team, but there's a realistic expectation that eventually the team will move on from him, and then there's a realistic path for a point guard prospect to eventually ascend to that role. With the shooting guard position, obviously we like Jalen right now, but he's not necessarily proven that much yet. So there's a realistic path that a shooting guard prospect could ascend into Jalen's role if for some reason the extensions don't work out or his performance doesn't. With, the center position, you obviously can play Alperen Sengun as the starter, and you'll still need, at the very least, a backup or an alternate look at the type of center that Alperen Sengun is for specific matchups. So there's a realistic path for a guy like Alex Sarr. If you can either play next to Sengun at the 4, or you could realistically expect him to back up Sengun and play certain matchups instead of Sengun on a long-term view. To me, those are the main differences between picking at 10 where they were and picking at 3 where they are now, and just feel incredibly blessed that this happened once again for us, and it's hard not to be excited about. 41 wins, we were on the verge of making the play-in, and we're going to add a premium asset on top of that, as well as the growth of the players currently in-house and, another offseason. And we still have Ime Udoka, who is both beloved by a lot of stars in this league and that has done a tremendous job. So it's actually pretty insane that the James Harden deal and this rebuild has gone as according to plan, and as high end of an outcome of that plan as it has so far.
And by the way, on the topic of centers, I was going to say Donovan Clingan, in my opinion, he is made for Ime Udoka. Now, I know it gets a little tricky because obviously Alperen Sengun is there now, and can you play those two guys together? Potentially, I think that's largely conditional on Sengun developing a respectable three-point shot. But when you look at a guy who is 7'2", or some reports have it 7'3", an elite rim protector, incredibly smart, can play out of the high post, can pass, just completely shuts down dribble penetration, can be a lob threat, even though he's not the most fluid athlete, he's good enough. To me, Donovan Clingan and Alperen Sengun, it reminds me a little bit of the mix of bigs that Ime had in Boston with guys like Robert Williams and Al Horford. And that was one of the first things that Ime said when he took the Houston job a year ago, was that they wanted to get different types of bigs. And of course, that was alluding to the pursuit of Brook Lopez, which didn't work out. I know Donovan Clingan is not really a stretch big like Lopez was, but he is that type of rim protector, that type of presence. I don't think they were going after Brook Lopez because they didn't believe in Sengun and that they wanted an excuse to get him off the team. No, it was that they wanted to play different ways. They wanted the optionality, and that's what I think Clingan could potentially bring. I know that's not the sexiest pick because there's not the superstar upside, and there's not the clear path to the starting lineup as currently constructed. But I do think the Rockets see it as a real need. It's something that hasn't really been addressed since Brook Lopez. You could argue they addressed it to an extent with Steven Adams, but it's only to an extent because he's a guy on a one-year deal who's now in his 30s and coming off of knee surgery. So to be determined as to whether that's going to pay off. But I just think that it's probably likely that the Rockets will be going through, I think, the college trio, because the Hawks and especially the Wizards, where they are, I tend to think they'll go for some higher upside swings. And I think the more clear path to superstardom would be in that international tier. I think the Rockets in their position would be a little more content if they stay with the pick to go for someone that's a little higher floor, which I think those college guys that have one or two elite skills would be. Also, from a valuation perspective, if they aren't playing initially, well, I think the Rockets and potentially other teams on the trade market, everyone knows that Donovan Clingan is going to be a solid rim protector at the NBA level. He can do a lot of things that Walker Kessler did as a rookie, and then some, because he's much more polished offensively. And even if there's not immediate playing time for him, or if it's limited, then you can trust that there's still going to be something there, even if there's a few G League minutes or just end of the bench stints early in his career. I think with Rob Dillingham, the movement shooting, with Reed Sheppard, just the ridiculous shooting in general, these are skills that even if the player doesn't play a lot out of the shoot, I think from the standpoint of the Rockets and other teams, they have a few ready-made skills that I think are fairly plug and play, and that when they get an opportunity, there are things that absolutely should translate, as opposed to, some of the prospects that are a bit more raw. Then it does get trickier if there's no path to immediate minutes, because the valuation might decline. Rockets would have a tough time projecting exactly where they fit in the longer term future. I could see the Rockets considering the college trio, simply because with the upside that's already in this core six, then you could go for a little bit of a higher floor at the expense of a ceiling. And I think that's honestly why it's pretty good the way the draft order stacked up, with the Rockets at 3, highest of any team in the West, and the only teams ahead of them, the Hawks and the Wizards. I think the Hawks and Wizards are likely to take guys that you're not going to say the Rockets wouldn't be interested in. I agree with you that if Alex Sarr was somehow on the board at 3, I would be overjoyed. But I just think that they're likely to leave players that would 100% fit in various constructs. And I think the Rockets will do their due diligence on all of it. And I do think the odds, I will say, the Rockets keeping the pick are definitely higher today than they were yesterday. Even though I do think they'll try and trade it, there's just too much upside, in my opinion, with where they are, to having this offseason be the time to make a bigger move. And we've heard whispers for a while that this could be the year that a lot of bigger names are potentially on the market. At the same time, there's a clear pathway now to the Rockets falling in love with one of these prospects themselves, to the point where it's enough that they'll just stay where they are. We've seen in the Rafael Stone era, think back to the Eric Gordon trade. They held him for a solid year beyond when most of us thought made the most sense to trade him. And ultimately they did get the value that they sought, and that first round swap ended up being what got them to Cam Whitmore. So we've seen Rafael Stone and the Rockets, this front office, be willing to set a high price when the asset is worth it. And if the offers are not meeting that price, then they're willing to stay the course and not panic. And that's what I think the way this board is likely to shake out, assuming that the Hawks and Wizards stay where they are. I think the Rockets are likely to have guys that are good enough that they won't move the pick just to move it. If you can get Donovan Clingan, who is even bigger than Steven Adams, has, I won't say comparable strength, but he should be one of the strongest players in the NBA, has a lot more diversity to his game offensively, and again, is a decade younger. I don't think Steven Adams would stop them from exploring that. If you can get Reed Sheppard or Rob Dillingham, guys that can shoot and create, even though there's some of that on the roster already, it's not proven enough when we talk about guys like Jalen Green and Cam Whitmore to where you would turn it down. In the case of Reed Sheppard, you can always use shooting. So I just think there's enough options there to where I think the Rockets will be satisfied if they stay the course. But at the end of the day, with so many big names being on the market, it's also tough for me to envision another team not being in a situation that could tempt the Rockets with a trade, because, it goes back to our last few episodes. The balance of power in the current NBA is unsustainable. There's have got to be a few teams that consider, taking a step back, because there's way too many teams aggressively trying to win now, whether it's Brandon Ingram, whether it's Paul George, whether it's Donovan Mitchell, maybe it's somebody off the radar entirely. There's just so many options that I tend to think that that's the likely scenario. But I think the floor is enough to where it just adds more intrigue. Bottom line, regardless of the outcome, the Rockets are just in a much better place, because the floor of whatever they get out of pick 3, whether it's they keep it or they trade it, the bottom line is they're going to get something they really, really like. And that was not necessarily the case before today.
So as far as pick 3 goes, I think there's one scenario that has kind of, it's not dead, but it's a lot harder to pull off at 3 than it is at 10, which is, in my opinion, trading. So I had mentioned that my ideal scenario, or I had hinted that my ideal scenario at 10 would have been to trade the pick for future picks. I think at 3, that's a lot harder to do, because one thing is you bet a prime asset for, another team's future, like in a James Harden trade, where you're likely losing value at the time, but you're betting on a team eventually falling apart. I think pick 3 is a pretty massive asset, and you'd be taking a pretty big risk if you just traded it for future picks, because it is, let's put the scenario like this. Let's call it the Suns picks, right? I'd say I'm pretty confident that the Suns picks are going to be good at some point. But they have Devin Booker. And so as long as he's there, there's a chance that they aren't that great. And if for some reason they take a couple of extra, since you're not going to get, 4 first-round picks or 8 years worth of team control like we did with the Brooklyn picks, if somehow they hang on to the mediocrity treadmill for a couple of years, and those couple of years happen to be the years you got the picks for, then you just trade pick 3 for pick 17 and 20 in 3 years from now. So I do think with pick 3, that's one of the scenarios that was one of my most ideal scenarios at 10, that at 3 just doesn't make that much sense because of how much of a gamble it would be. So besides that, I also want to touch on, you touched on, it's, obviously I don't have a solid take on anything right now, but it would be pretty disappointing to me if they, prioritized not winning now, but guys that have current skill sets that could help in the short term over guys with high upside at this point. Mainly because, first of all, I really trust the Vipers as a development system with what they did with, we can go all the way back to Isaiah Hartenstein, who looked like a baller there. We can go all the way back to how good Josh Christopher looked there, how good Cam Whitmore looked there, how good KPJ looked there, how good Man Thompson looked there, and you can go on and on and on. And I think they are a competent enough G-League setup that's to the point where I would be comfortable just picking a guy with upside and letting him be there for a full year with limited opportunities with the main team when those arise through injuries. I think with as much young talent as the Rockets do have that is ready to play right now, taking a guy that can, just because he's more likely to be able to play sooner, to me is a mistake. For these reasons, as well as if you want a guy to help right now, the Rockets have avenues to go get that guy via free agency with the MLE or via trade with some of the contracts that they currently have.
I will say an important theme here is optionality. We spoke a little while ago about the possibility of packaging 3 with other players for a potential star upgrade, maybe a low-end star. But there's also a world in which, for whatever reason, another team wants other assets, and then perhaps pick 3 becomes useful from the standpoint of filling a rotation spot on the cheap. I don't think that's the likely scenario, but it's one that's at least in play. And so I'm sure they'll leave no stone unturned, pardon the pun.
So could you see a scenario where, listen, this is going to catch a lot of flack, but I'm not saying this guy in particular or whatever guy in particular, but a scenario where instead of moving pick 3, you move Nets picks plus Jalen Green, Nets picks plus
that's what I mean.
Thompson.
I don't think it's likely, but it's plausible.
Yeah, so you'd move one of the cores, not you, right? But in this hypothetical, one of the core 6 would be moved, and then at 3 you would draft someone to replace him. To me, that would make some sense. Like if you obviously don't have to, but if you were to move a guy like Jalen, for example, and then you draft a guy like Rob Dillingham, who I think has some similarities to Jalen, although I think he is smarter with the ball in his hands. He's better to control the pick and roll. He is obviously way less athletic, way smaller, but he has better package at the rim. He has obviously a better shot to this point. But you would then perhaps maybe even slot Cam Whitmore into the starting lineup for the first year, and then you move a guy like Dillingham into the bench, and you have him with Man Thompson running that second unit. To me, something like that could make sense, right? Depending on the value that you can get for pick 3 versus for whatever one of the young guys that you would be moving. But yeah, to me, without a scenario like that, I would be swinging for upside. I think, I'm obviously not plugged in with what the Rockets are trying to do, but I think ultimately, at least from the past few drafts, they've loved to draft upside. I think that at this point it will make more sense than ever to draft that upside because you now do have the time to let that upside flourish slowly. And I want to touch on Donovan Clingan in specific. I'm not too impressed, I would say. I saw your parallel with Ime Udoka and the 2-pick setup that they had with Orford and Rob Will. Big part of why that happened was because both Rob Will, even though he was used as a roamer, he was pretty good at defending the perimeter. I don't see any potential whatsoever for Donovan Clingan to ever defend the perimeter. So to me, it's tough for him to play that role. And then obviously Al Horford's one of the smartest defenders ever. And he could also defend the perimeter to some extent. And space the floor, which Clingan can't. So it would be tough for me to see Clingan slotting into that role as well. What I would say, and I think this is a hot take, and sounds really, it's Rockets related because of the impact it would have on pick 3, but it's about another franchise. I see a lot of people coming right away and saying the Hawks are going to draft Alex Sarr. He makes too much sense. Listen, Alex Sarr is not ready to play right now. The Hawks are in a position where they need to start winning. They need to shake something up. And not only that, Sarr is, although he is long, he's not your prototypical rim protector. He's obviously not the skinny type of rim protectors. As far as centers goes, you have obviously Wembanyama, who is generational, can't compare. And you have Chet Holmgren, who is much further along defensively than Sarr is, even though Sarr has the potential. They cannot plug and play. I don't think they can plug and play Alex Sarr at this point. And there is some switchability, some switch potential with him. But then you look at the Hawks center rotation, and they already have Onyeka Okongwu, who they just extended. And he's now developed a three-point shot. He and Sarr would play sort of a similar role in an assumed rim protector switchable center combo, even though Sarr can probably play both to a lesser extent. What would not surprise me, and I think year one would probably be a 1-for-1 switch that would save the Hawks a lot of money. Probably not to draft him at 1, but Donovan Clingan makes a lot of sense in the Clint Capella role, a lot more sense than Sarr does right away. And if you watch them play, you can tell that Clingan, obviously more skilled offensively, way better touch. But the Clint Capella, he's a lot more like Clint Capella than Sarr is like Clint Capella. And, I'm just not sold on Alex Sarr being a runaway front runner for the number 1 overall pick with the Hawks. I even think that the Hawks could very well just move the pick and shake some things around within their roster.
Well, I could also see the Hawks moving Trey or Deontay and using this number 1. I was thinking they might use it as a stimulus to the next generation because there's been talk already. I think this could potentially, if they like Sarr enough, be a pivot point to where they go into something of a rebuild. But to what you were saying, if they want to stay the course, then yeah, Clingan is much more plug and play. To defend myself a little bit, what I was saying with Clingan and the Rockets, it's not that it's identical to, Robert Williams and Al Horford in terms of the skill set. It's just a contrast relative to Alperen Sengun in that he has the physique, the rim protection to guard some of the guys that Sengun can struggle with and to actually be a deterrent on drives near the rim and just completely, take away one side of the court. That's something that Sengun can't do. I think it's something that drew them to Brook Lopez. And so wasn't trying to say it's a drop-in replacement for the Williams Horford formula, just that it's a contrast to what they have with Sengun. But yeah, to your point about the Hawks, yeah, it just depends on what path they want to take. I was thinking they might use it as a pivot point to take a step back. But yeah, if they want to say, hey, we like Trey, we like Murray, there's a path forward as is, then yeah, maybe they take Clingan because he is more plug and play and more ready to make an impact in year 1.
You could then spend the 20 to 25, I'm not sure where between 20 and 25 Clint's salary currently sits at, but you'd save a lot of money getting him. Obviously not at pick 1. I think at this point, if this were to happen, I think they will trade down, perhaps get a couple more assets and draft Clingan later on. But and the other thing that I would mention is it's definitely the Hawks, right? Because regardless of who stays, Trey or the Dejounte, none of those guys are, at the age where they would probably be okay with sitting through a restart of a rebuild or even just pulling it back for a couple more years before going at it again. Listen, the Dejounte is 27 or 28 at this point. Trey has gone through a rebuild, gone up until the Western Conference Finals, and then came all the way back down. So unless they went, full blow up, I'll struggle to see Sarr as the pick for a long-term thing. But regardless, I wonder, let me ask you something for a change. Do you think there's any chance that the Rockets would consider moving up for Sarr in a situation where the Hawks are not totally convinced on trading for him? Because I think Sarr is, just to make the case a little bit before you go, Sarr is a lot of the things that we're seeing coming to the NBA and be successful. The new age of contending teams or what are going to be contending teams with Chet Holmgren, obviously, and Wemby are these skinny, wiry rim protectors that can space the floor and be insanely versatile. Sarr fits into that mold, and it could be a unique way for the Rockets to be able to match those teams and what those teams are able to give while not sacrificing too much of what makes the Rockets the Rockets. It could be quite a unique opportunity to go ahead and move up and get a guy like that versus, the Rockets at 3 are in a pretty unique position. Could you see them, instead of moving out or drafting the pick, potentially even moving up, considering if the tiers are, that close together, it may not be a huge price.
If they like him enough, absolutely. I think we've said for a while that the NBA is a quality over quantity league, and they've got a decent amount of young assets. And we've talked about the potential to consolidate some of these assets for a proven star. But if they think that they'll go through the process, they'll scout all of these guys. If they like Alex Sarr enough to where they're convinced on him having legitimate star potential and there's a deal to be had at a reasonable cost, then it's unconventional. I mean, in a perfect world, you wouldn't add another 19-year-old to the mix, but I don't see why you wouldn't, because again, the name of the game is getting all-star talent. That's what they're trying to do. And while you'd love it to be someone that's more proven, if you like him enough and the cost is reasonable, I don't know why you'd foreclose yourself to that possibility.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. I think 3 is a very versatile spot because, as I said before, I think that will end up being, even if it's not a full tier, it'll be, at the end of whatever you want to call it, a sub tier or something like that, where I think it wouldn't be too expensive to move up, but it could be quite lucrative to move down for compensation. But it's a really tough draft, and I think I just need to do more scouting work to.
Yeah.
Although I will mention before I don't know how much longer we're going to go, but I have to mention that Rafael Stone wants to do the typical Rafael Stone thing and get an absolute steal in the late teens, trading back with someone and getting Khalil Ware at
Your boy.
at 15 through 20. I guarantee you in a year's time he'll be what Cam Whitmore and Tarvison were at the exact same range. Just look out. I have no idea how this guy's mocked so low with his skill set, and how, I was debating the merits of him versus Sarr, not as prospects. Eventually, I obviously lean towards Sarr, but I think it's a discussion that they both have things over the other. For the people out there listening to the pod, don't let people tell you he's just Cristiano 2.0. It's not the case. If you come at me with that take, I'll just instantly reject it.
I think if they were to get a pick in that range, I think they'd be more likely to acquire it through other means than by trading back. Unless the guy is so loved by them, and if that's the case, I doubt they'd even risk trading back into the 15 to 20 range. In this draft, the 15 through 20 range is not going to be all that prohibitive to trade into. So if you really like a guy that's going to be in that range, you could trade a future first, combination of some of your young guys. I don't think it would be that difficult to acquire the pick to where you would want to trade back. And the Rockets are at a point now where they don't really need more quantity. They want quality. So my guess is that it wouldn't be trading back from 3. I think they'd have 3 in its own tier. Either they keep it and draft someone they really like, or they trade out altogether as part of a deal for a veteran win now piece. And I still think, as I've said a few times, that's the most likely scenario. Just don't quite know just yet who that's going to be. But if you want to get someone in, say, the back half of the first round, rather than trade 3 for that, because 3 just gives you so much high-end optionality, I think you can acquire a pick in that range without surrendering 3 as part of the package. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. I think I find it tough to believe that the Rockets could move into that range again, just because I don't know if we have the mid-level type of assets that in a weak draft it would take to move into a spot like that. The only way I could ever see
the
it
Brooklyn
happening,
assets are pretty strong.
For sure. No, I'm saying that they're too good.
Oh, I wouldn't say that. No, I would give up a Brooklyn asset before I'd give up the number 3, at least the more forward years. Because I think by 2027, maybe 2026, but definitely by 2027, the Nets are, I guess if I was ranking the Rockets trade assets by this pick going to 3, I would be much more willing to trade certainly the 2027 swap and maybe even the 2026 before I would give up the 3. There's value in the certainty of an asset this high.
Oh no, for sure. And then there's value in the fact that this asset is already like condensed into one big asset rather than a few smaller ones. What I was getting at, it was that I wouldn't probably trade one of those Brooklyn Breaks for a mid-teens pick in this draft. And just looking at the draft order, maybe you could make the case that, with the only rebuilding teams that I would consider, that I would think that they could possibly be looking to move up to number 3 would probably be, I can think of 2 scenarios off the top of my head. If they like the scenario that I thought was out of the table because the pick was too high, I think the Raptors have pick 19, and you could trade maybe 3 for 19 and a couple of future firsts, for example. That could make sense, and if you think that, if you like me, think Ware is, I think he's a top 9 guy in this draft. It could make sense. The other one that I could see is Portland's picking at 7 and at 14. And at 14, you're guaranteed to get Ware. And at 7, you may still get one of Topic, Rob Dillingham, or Reed Sheppard. But at that point, but that again that goes against the point that we've been making the entire season, which is, well, we don't really have space for 2 prospects. So I'm just looking at it value-wise, right? In reality, it's obviously much tougher because of how crowded our young core is.
What I would say, and I guess this is a good way to sum it all up, the lottery today completely changed the complexion of asset management in terms of the remainder of these Brooklyn draft picks. And that I think most of us before today viewed this pick as the most likely to be moved simply because it was the least desirable. The next couple of draft classes are supposed to be stronger. But by moving to number 3 overall and the certainty of getting close to your pick of the litter this year, and again, just look back to 2020 as an example, even if the draft class as a whole is supposed to be a little underwhelming, there's value in being able to get your guy if you trust your draft gurus and your ability to, draft at a high level, which the Rockets generally have under Rafael Stone. Then all of a sudden, this 2024 pick to me has a lot more asset value than certainly 2027. And you can make a case for the 2025 swap and the 2026 direct pick, although those are supposed to be better draft years. So there is a counter argument to that. I would just say that in general, I don't know if I'd call it an A asset, but you've got at worst, I'd say a B+ level asset if we were going to grade on the scale of what the Rockets add to their stockpile, whether they keep the pick or whether they move it. And it's just completely changed the calculus for me in a way that I was certainly not expecting. But at the end of the day, that's why you get so many years to bring this full circle of unprotected assets. That's why there's so much value in that. All it takes is 1 or 2 of those years, the luck going your way, either with the lottery gods smiling on you the way they clearly did today, or the last couple of drafts, getting guys that were insanely talented to fall to you, like Tari Eason, like Cam Whitmore, then that completely changes the expected value. And so that's why when you can stack just year after year of unprotected team control, that's why that was such a brilliant move by Rafael that is paying dividends. Certainly got lucky, but again, luck is where preparation meets opportunity. And I think that's the best way to describe what's happened here. Paolo, before we sign off, is there anything else that you want to add? We didn't get too in the weeds as far as the prospects, because I think both of us, we talked about it before we started recording. We haven't gotten too far down the road of analyzing these prospects at the top of the draft because it was so unlikely for the Rockets to be up there. Now it's time to do some homework, and we'll have some guests the way we have in years past. We didn't think we'd do that as much this offseason because with the Rockets coming off 41-41 year, I thought it'd be much more about trade talks than draft analysis, the way that the last few years it was obvious the Rockets were likely going to keep those picks with high upside guys like Jalen and Jabari and Amin Thompson. Well, now all of a sudden there's a very realistic case where you end up keeping this pick as well based on the potential upside. So we will do our due diligence the way we did the last couple of years, getting some draft gurus in. Today's episode, just initial thoughts reacting to what's been just a fantastic day to be a Rockets fan. Paolo, anything you want to add before we close out?
Yeah, it's. I'll just say this has been the most unprepared I have ever been for a podcast, and I think
Same,
this
same.
makes the rest of the offseason so interesting because there's so with the draft. Like usually at this point last year, everybody knew there was a clear tier one with or a tier one, and then the second tier with Brendan Miller and Scoot Anderson. There was obviously the big three in the Banchero Holmgren Jabari Smith draft. The year before, there was obviously Jalen Mobley and Kate Cunningham. This year, it feels so wide open that there's so many ways everything could go, and there's so many possibilities that you have to entertain when you're going through the tape on these guys. I mean, right now, I just fired off a tweet just thinking, I've obviously only started, really watching film on some of these guys, today, and I will just, I just remembered. Listen, I mentioned so my very very early comps for Reed Sheppard were, poor man Steph Curry, a little bit of Tyrese Halliburton in the sense that he reads screens really well and he only needs a little bit of space to get his shot off, and he's very, intentional in the way that he punishes guys that go under. Jalen can obviously punish guys that go under, but he's not decisive enough, so it doesn't matter. A guy that I completely forgot, which has a similar game that's heavily reliant on a jump shot, either a three or a long mid-range shot with limited finishing at the rim, is obviously Fred VanVleet, who is currently on the roster. And imagine a guy with as deeper range and has the size of shooting as Reed Sheppard was with Kentucky, operating a pick and roll without Brent Şengün, and how much space he would get. We have, part of the reason why we struggle with spacing is because our guard ball handlers aren't that quick to pull the trigger when enough space is given to them, and so eventually that space shrinks back down. If you don't take the initial window, you're not gonna be able to capitalize on the value that having operating on the screen for you provides. Reed Sheppard is very decisive when it comes to shooting, and that two-man game, I think, long term, even if Fred VanVleet's still here for year one, that's pretty enticing, man. And so I guess just this to say, this has happened within the first day. By next week, I'll have a lot more of these
Yourself into it,
kind of
yeah.
point. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, well, and you'll also talk yourself into potentially keeping the pick because, again, for I think months now, we've talked about the Rockets having a win now emphasis, and combine that with picking at 9 or 10, you're not getting your pick, and so we'd all just sort of resigned ourselves to the likelihood that it'd be traded out in one form or another. Now, with you being able to have your pick of these guys at the top of the pool, then it's going to be all the more easier for us to fall in love with certain guys and to be a bit more hesitant in these trade hypotheticals that we throw out. One name I should have mentioned earlier, we talked about Brandon Ingram, mentioned Paul George and Donovan Mitchell, didn't get too down the road with those names because we talked about them in our Logger Line archives. One other name that we should mention, Mikal Bridges. We know the Rockets have inquired about him in the past. This is what would have been Brooklyn's pick. The Nets, there is a world where if it gets to late June and they're not getting any traction on a deal for a big name, I could see that perhaps not dealing Bridges to the Rockets at the trade deadline when Houston reportedly expressed interest could have been because they didn't want to commit to a rebuild, especially not knowing that the pick would be high and wanting the possibility to pursue a star themselves. Well, now that pursuit, if it doesn't work out and they have the certainty of the pick being high, I could see a deal involving that pick and perhaps Dylan Brooks being more enticing to the Nets, both from a timeline perspective and an asset perspective, than it would have been if abstractly the Rockets had said in late January or February, hey, we'll trade you your pick this year, plus, Dylan Brooks or whatever other filler it might be. The question now is that enough value for the Rockets? You talked about, the low-end star and Brandon Ingram meets that. Does Mikal Bridges meet that for you?
I would. So I tweeted today. I would not do it straight up. The framework that I would have in mind that I have pretty big doubts that the Nets would go for. Nick Claxton's currently a free agent. Nick Claxton currently perfectly fits the alternate type of center to Alperen Şengün that we would be looking for from an age profile and a skill set profile standpoint. But the best I could do, the meme from Pawn Stars. The best I can do is pick three Dylan Brooks and Steven Adams for Bridges and Claxton in a sign and trade. That's the best I could do. I would not do it straight up. I think we have leverage, like we have massive amounts of leverage over the Nets, and I would only do it because I know that that would make them worse next year, and so that would boost the pick next year as well. I wouldn't do it straight up because
Yeah.
it falls back to what we've been saying. We have plenty of prospects coming down the pipeline to play the 3 and the 4 on this team, and unless you want to be playing Mikal Bridges at the 2 consistently, it is doing that to me is basically the same as drafting a guy like French Zach dude from that's currently at the top of some boards. Just to me, it doesn't make much sense to put even more value into what I think. Listen, I think Tari Eason next year will be more than a starting level 3 already. I think he already was this year, didn't get a chance to show it. So I don't want to get someone who's going to be playing in front of him, because I think it would be a valid discussion between who's the better player between Mikal Bridges and Tari Eason as far as contributing to winning goes by this very next season.
Well, it's just crazy to think about because as recently as a few months ago, the Rockets were reportedly willing, I don't know if I buy that they were willing to throw every future Brooklyn pick into a deal for Mikal Bridges. I think some of that reporting was exaggerated, but at least some of them. And now this pick and what's believed to be a weaker than normal draft all of a sudden might be more valuable by itself. And yet I do think there's validity to that argument when you're as high as number 3 overall and you have your choice. It's just crazy how much this can flip. And again, it goes back to the brilliance of the James Harden trade was acquiring all those years of unprotected assets, because if there are no protections, all it takes is one positive bounce, one break to go your way, and it completely changes the calculus. And that was, there's just so much desire when these trades get initially graded for there to be certainty. And so because the Rockets couldn't say, okay, we're clearly going to get a top shelf asset in X year, then there was this wave of, oh, how could you trade an all-star level James Harden? It might have just been a 20% chance, which it was today for the Brooklyn pick to get into the top 4. But if you can stack multiple 20% chances together, which is what happens when you have all these years of completely unprotected picks, then all of a sudden it does become pretty likely that one of those, at least one, is going to be friendly for you. And ultimately that's what happened today. And now all of a sudden, what would have been part of a package for Mikal Bridges just a few months ago might be better than Mikal simply by itself. One other name I want to throw out there, I know need to wrap up, but God, my mind is spinning at this point. Lauri Markkanen. What would you think about that hypothetical? Utah's a team that actually, they were tanking. They were 5-25 in their last 30, and they actually fell from 8 to 10 with both the Rockets and Hawks moving up. Would Markkanen be enough to where you would explore moving the 3 if Danny Ainge wanted to talk about that?
I mean, it's been 2 years at this point where Markkanen has played like an all-star. I don't think I could say no.
Same. I think he does meet the bar.
Yeah, but so much so that I don't think the Jazz would do it straight up.
No, not straight up. You probably have to do a little more with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, just as a concept.
But
it might be one of those scenarios you were saying earlier where the Rockets' lack of mid-tier pieces, like number 3 and filler for Markkanen might not be enough for the Jazz. But then if it has to be number 3 and a member of the core 6, then that might be too much from a Rockets perspective.
Not only that, I think if you do make a trade for Markkanen, I think Markkanen is your 4 for the next however many years. Let me just double check how his contract situation is looking. He has 1 more year at a very cheap deal. You'd have bird rights, so you could extend them. But anyways, this to say, I think if you made a deal like that, you'd have to trade Sheppard because he'll only decrease in value from this point forward. I don't think realistically he'll be able to play the 3, and I think he's too good of a prospect for you to have him coming off the bench. So
would you trade Jabari in the 3 plus filler for Markkanen, or is that too much?
To me, that's too much. I would probably try to move Jabari. Maybe move Jabari for future assets and use one of those future assets combined with the number 3 pick for Lauri, and you get a little bit of flexibility moving forward as far as mid-tier level assets go, and you get Markkanen, but you do lose 3 plus Sheppard. But at that point, I would probably consider it. This is obviously without putting too much thought into it, just on the hot.
Yeah.
Just giving the hot take.
And of course, like Brandon Ingram, he will be a free agent in the 2025 offseason. So just as you would want to make sure you're on the same page that Ingram is regarding the next contract, the same can be said with Lauri Markkanen as well. just want to go through the exercise of guys that potentially could be fits. We've talked about Paul George and Donovan Mitchell in the past. Today, we talked about Lauri Markkanen, Mikal Bridges, Brandon Ingram. Those are the types of names that could be available. Don't think it's a given that the Rockets do it, but certainly they will leave no stone unturned. Have to throw in that pun one more time before we close out. All right, well, we will wrap it here. We've been all over the map, and I think at this point, our brains are just scrambled. So much has changed with the valuation of this asset based on today. It's in a good way, but I think we'll have better episodes in the coming weeks as we do a little more homework as far as what the options are for the Rockets if they keep the pick, and we'll have some guests who have done a bit more scouting as to the 2024 draft pool to help us with that as well. This is just meant to be our initial reaction on this Sunday, May 12th, to the incredibly positive news of the Rockets getting a top 15% outcome of that Brooklyn pick somehow ending up in the top 3 of a draft pool that, again, supposed to be weaker than normal, but all of a sudden I'm warming up to it as well, and I'm sure I'll warm up to it even more as we start doing more film work and seeing the positives that come out of some of these prospects. All right, well, this is where we'll wrap it for today. Until next time, the best place to get a hold of Paolo and myself is on Twitter, where I'm on there at Ben Dubose, Paolo's on there at Paolo Alves NBA, and the show is on there at The Logger Line, where if you go to the link tree in the Twitter bio, you can find our friends, partners, and sponsors, links to their content, Carback Brewing, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Sports Talk 790, but also our individual distributors of this program, Apple, Google, Spotify, those types of platforms. Please subscribe, leave a positive review if you've not already. That way you can get the benefit of episodes right when they come out, and we get the benefit with your subscription. Hopefully your happy review and looking good to those friends, partners, and sponsors as one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. We'll be active during the 2024 offseason, which all of a sudden, based on today's outcome, has a lot more intrigue than we thought a day or two ago. A lot of us felt like it might be a quiet offseason without any huge moves of consequence. Boy, it feels like even if they just stay the course with pick 3, there's going to be a lot more excitement based on who they bring in than a lot of us anticipated when the Rockets went into this draft lottery with the number 9 odds slot with that Brooklyn pick. So a lot of exciting things to talk about, but whatever the outcome, of course, we'll have it covered right here at the Logger Line, your source for podcast commentary on all things Houston Rockets basketball. And with that, we'll put a bow on this. For Paolo Alves, I'm Ben Dubose. As always, thanks for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode.